Um, yes, it is great to be here with you. I'm going to ask you to turn with me in your Bibles to Acts chapter 17 this morning. I like being at this part of the state. My dad grew up in Eden and came to Christ through the ministry of First Baptist Church in Eden up there, a sister church of yours. And I grew up in a sister church of yours in the Binghamton area. So I always kind of feel a little nostalgic when I get out to western New York here. Love to be here. I did not make it up to the kazoo factory, however, in Eden. I'll have to save that for another trip. Just to let you know, I do know something about Eden. I know there's a kazoo factory there. So I have a ministry called Addison's Walk Institute for Christian Studies. You may have seen our table on your way in, and yes, I'll be hawking our wares in between church and Sunday school and after today. And just to tell you very briefly what that is, I am a missionary to college students in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So we started Addison's Walk a little over 8 years ago. I was pastoring an inner city church in Scranton and got an opportunity to be an adjunct professor at one of our local schools, not Clark Summit University, formerly Baptist Bible College. If you're thinking, well, you're near BBC, do you mean that you got to teach at BBC? No. I mean one of the local schools in the city limits of Scranton. And I suddenly realized that of the 5 colleges or universities within the city limits of Scranton, there's not one Christian organization on any of them. And I started complaining to God about that and saying, hey, God, why don't you do something about this? There are 10,000 students here that represent an unreached people group. The world is coming to us in Scranton, and no one's telling them about you. Do something. Well, as you can imagine, God said, hey, dummy, why don't you do something? You live within walking distance of most of those schools, and just 4 of them, in fact, and the one is just on the other side of town. And I think I have perfectly positioned you both geographically and academically to do something about it. So we learned of the model of college engagement called the study center model. That might be something unfamiliar to you. During my last residency at Biola University. And we started investigating it and figured out, yeah, this is something we can do. So the difference between us and, say, InterVarsity, because I know you all support local InterVarsity missionary Josh, right? The difference between us and, say, InterVarsity, Crew, Ratio Christi, any of those organizations is that we are not a club. So I cannot set up my table in the student union. I can't put up posters. I cannot openly invite students to anything in any official capacity. However, I have access to students that some of these other on-campus organizations are losing because some campus ministry organizations are actually being kicked off campus. This is happening in our area, so just south of us is Wilkes-Barre, and there's a couple larger schools there, and they have traditional club ministries, and they've actually been kicked off campus. They can't meet on campus. I'm not quite sure how legal that is, but that's what the school is doing. So I have access that these other organizations would really die for, in that I have a little piece of plastic in my wallet, and it says faculty on it. So I get to be in the classroom. I have direct access to students every day this semester, 5 days a week. I'm an adjunct philosophy professor at the University of Scranton, and I'm having the time of my life as I engage students, and because we get to talk about fundamental issues, and I dangle the carrot in front of them and say, hey, if you want to talk about this stuff more, I'd love to buy you the age-appropriate beverage of your choosing, which is normally tea or whatever kombucha is. I'm not sure what that is, but they buy that a lot. It looks like fermented cottage cheese. I don't know what's going on there, but any of these things, and so real ministry happens outside of the classroom. We come right up to the edge in the classroom very often, but outside of the classroom with these conversations, and this is where I really get to share the gospel, and I can be very open with my faith in the classroom. But anyway, if you want to ask me questions about that, about our organization, we are a legit 501c3 because the IRS said so, so I have their blessing. Just saying, right? So we have their blessing. So if you want to ask me anything about that, I'll certainly be out by my table in between this morning, and I can stick around for as long as you would like to chat this afternoon. All right? Sound like a deal? Excellent. All right. As a guy that's a missionary, when you hear missionary and they say open your Bibles, you usually expect them to turn to one of a few usual suspect passages, right? Like the fields are white unto harvest, or here am I, send me, or Acts 1:8, or Matthew 28, or something like that, all appropriate. But I have what I like to call hashtag philosopher probs. So I'm not going to go to one of those passages. We're going to be looking at Acts 17, which I like to think of as Paul at the University of Athens. Now, to be honest, there is no University of Athens when Paul is there. That's not a real thing. But it is, Acts 17, the second half thereof, is one of the two classic college passages in the Bible. And some of you are looking at me like, okay, there are two classic college passages in the Bible? Yes, you didn't know that. Acts 17 is one. The other one is Daniel 1 in the first half of chapter 2, wherein you have Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that are forced to enroll at the University of Babylon, King's College. Ashpenaz is the dean of students. Come on, think about it. There's a meal plan, right? There's ID cards. And in the first half of chapter 2, you actually read about the first college prayer meeting. After you read about Arioch, the head of campus security that's sent out to kill everybody. I mean, they take campus security like for reals at the University of Babylon. So if you ever want to invite me back, hint, hint, wink, wink, I would be glad to share with you my insights on University of Babylon, which, by the way, is a fascinating way to think through that scripture through that kind of lens. When I started driving, my dad sat me down and tried to explain some things about cars to me. Now, I had a true classic when I began driving. You're going to be all jealous, so I'm going to ask you to please contain yourselves. I had a 1984 Plymouth Horizon. Yes, a 1984 Plymouth Horizon. The steering wheel was about this big. Whoever designed that car didn't understand things like ratio. But the steering wheel was way too big for that car. It was a 4-speed on the floor, and I had an AM radio, and it was metallic brown. It sparkled in the sun. It was a glorious teenager's beater, and I did some pretty stupid things with that car, like tried to see how well it could glide. That's a whole other story. We won't talk about the glide ratio of that vehicle at this moment. Let's just say I broke a strut. And had to explain that to my dad. How do you manage to break a strut on your car, Andy? Well, when you jump the railroad tracks, Dad, it tends to happen. So in learning to drive, he's just being a good dad, and he was instructing me, and he said, now, Andy, there's going to come a time you're going to come out to this car or any other, but more than likely this piece of junk that you're driving, and you're going to stick the key in the ignition and turn it, and not much is going to happen. And when that occurs, he said, you need to understand that there's really one of 3 reasons why the car isn't starting, or even if it's kind of turning over, it's not catching. So he talked to me about the 3 necessary causes for an internal combustion engine to operate. He said, so if you're turning that key and nothing's happening, it's got to be either the engine is not getting fuel, so either you're a knucklehead and you ran out of gas, or you have a blocked fuel line or a bad fuel filter. Or number 2, it's not getting enough oxygen. No air is getting in to the engine, so perhaps you have a blocked air filter coming into your engine. Or 3, and he said this is the most likely because you're not dumb enough to run out of gas all the time. So the third one, which is most likely, is that it's not getting any ignition. There's no spark. So perhaps your battery is dead, or the alternator has gone bad, thus far the battery's dead, or your spark plugs are just totally jacked up. But it's got to be one of those 3 things. All 3 are necessary for the engine to run, right? They're all 3 necessary. Are any of them by themselves sufficient for the engine to run? No. You need all 3. We could apply that same logic to, say, building a campfire. You need the same basic 3 things. You need oxygen, fuel, and an ignition source. Unless out here in Western New York, you just go full-on cowboy and it's gasoline match and running room. I don't recommend that, but those are 3 ways you could look at it as well. liquid Boy Scout, if you prefer. But none of those three things by themselves is enough. You need all three. Me standing here in front of you, there are several of my bodily systems that are working well enough together that allow me to stand here and communicate to you. Not one of them by themselves is sufficient. Just my skeletal system is not sufficient, or my cardiovascular system, or my endocrine system, any of those things. None of them by themselves is sufficient. Now, if one of them decides to do its own thing this morning and go haywire, the whole thing's going to fall apart. But I need all of those things to be working somewhat together. Paul, in his second missionary journey, as he arrives in Athens, is going to recognize that there are three necessary pieces or necessary causes that together are going to equal sufficiency in ministry. As he comes to a place where there is no church, this isn't a place where he's encouraging the believers in the church because there isn't one. And Athens in Acts chapter 17 is really a bit of a microcosm of our world. So certainly we are not a pre-Christian society, but we are rapidly moving towards being a post-Christian society, where fewer and fewer people have any understanding of what the Bible is, who God is, what church is all about. We are rapidly moving in that direction. So I think you'll find some interesting parallels. So this morning, as we start thinking together, I want to introduce you to the first sufficient idea, first necessary idea that's going to lead to the sufficient idea, and that is understanding. So in Acts chapter 17, beginning in verse 16, here's what it says. And I'm reading from the New International Version this morning. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, so the them he is waiting for are Silas and Timothy, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting." All right, so here is the first piece where we're going to see Paul in some understanding. Now, Acts 17, the second half of it, is kind of a preacher's dream because it breaks up nicely into three parts, right? So I have my three pieces I'm going to share with you this morning, but I'm going to warn you right now, I'm going to spend the majority of my time on the first third, and then the second two-thirds we're going to really kick into high gear, and I'm going to give you an overview, and you can look at that on your own. But I want to spend time in the first third because generally this is the kind of thing that we tend to skip over. Because when we see words that we aren't really sure what they mean, or they seem archaic, ancient, old, or useless to us, we kind of skip over them when we're reading the Bible. Many of us have been conditioned to do that. I know I was. And we'll see these words and say, well, Epicureans and Stoics, that's old dusty dead dudes. That has nothing to do with me in the 21st century, except for it does. So we're going to talk about those folks, and we're going to talk about the very language that they use in talking to Paul. And we may discover that there's something more there than we may actually think. So, in this opening third, here's what I want to concentrate on, Paul's understanding. Now, would you consider, ladies and gentlemen, Paul highly educated or just basically educated? Highly educated. And if that makes you uncomfortable that I'm asking you questions out loud, well, you can't stop me. So I'm gonna do that, right? He is highly educated. So we get really a glimpse of that in places like Philippians, right? Philippians 3, when Paul says something to the effect of, hey, if anybody wants to boast in all the things that they have accomplished, look at me. And he starts laying out his curriculum vitae of all the things that, how he was just born into a certain tribe of Benjamin. He is a Pharisee, so he's an expert in the law, and he's got it all down, right? So we know that he's highly educated. He's also educated in what we would call a classical education. So even by Paul's day, there is a body of literature and schools of thought and ideas that have been circulating in the ancient Mediterranean world that even by Paul's day are ancient, are very old. They've been around for a long time. He's studied these things. As a guy that's a philosophy professor, I can see within Paul's writings, I can see connections to things that Plato, Aristotle wrote 400 and 300 years before the time of Paul, and then some. I can actually see a connection to those ideas because God used the pagan Greeks to help prepare the mind for the categories of Christianity. I see Paul using those things. So I know he was classically educated. And as he comes into Athens, I almost said as he comes into Scranton, which wouldn't be all that inappropriate, but as he comes into Athens, he makes some observations. And this is showing his understanding. First thing that he understands is that Paul knew that everyone at the core is religious. Paul knew that. And we're going to see this really come out when he gets to what I like to think of as the faculty lounge of the University of Athens, the Areopagus. And as he stands and he says, "Men of Athens, I perceive in every way you are very religious," right? So Paul understands that everyone at the core is religious. We tend to think, perhaps, of a place like Athens that is a pre-Christian society, that they are irreligious. That would be absolutely untrue. Athens as a city, Athens as a city-state, Athens as a culture, and Greece overall is an extremely religious place. Paul understands that they are religious because Paul understands that every person on the planet is a believer, just like today. Now, if that strikes you as odd, I did not say every person on the planet is a Christian. There's a difference. We use synonymously the words believer and Christian sometimes, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But if we really want to parse the words, they are not the same thing. Every person on the planet is a believer because every person on the planet believes something. So even if it's stated as negatively, well, I do not believe in God, that is still an area of belief. And if they are being consistent, they will act on that belief in faith. If they really are going to be consistent, and I could give you examples from philosophy of people that did that, I could show you that they acted consistently, that they do not believe that God exists. But Paul knew that every person on the planet is religious. He knows that the people of Athens are extremely religious. Let me give you a little bit of background in Athens as we move into the idea of Paul is distressed by the idolatry there. Athens was burned to the ground in 480 BC. So if you were to turn in your Old Testaments to the book of Esther, you would actually get a very small glimpse as to what was going on in the world at that time. So who's the bad guy? The big bad guy in Esther? No, it's Haman, but who's beyond Haman? Like, who's the big, bad, tough dude? Who's at the very top of the bunch in Esther? The king. What's his name? Xerxes, right? Xerxes. He is the son of Darius, or Darius the first. That's the Daniel in the Lion's Den guy. Right? Darius the first, this is all going to make sense here, in 490 BC, 10 years prior, attempted an invasion of Greece. And without giving you all the geopolitical background of why he was doing that, suffice it to say that what they wanted to do was put down Athens, because Athens was fomenting revolt in their eastern colonies, which is modern-day Western Turkey, which was part of the Persian Empire. So along the coast of Turkey, places like where Troy, Ephesus, those kind of places are, and the islands there, the Athenians were kind of encouraging those folks to revolt against the Persian Empire. So Darius said, well, we're going to go take care of that, and ain't nobody going to tell us what to do. So he assembles a pretty large army, slaps them into boats, sails across the Aegean, and while they're disembarking there in 490 BC, they are met by the Athenian army, the Athenian infantry. and they rout the Persians. They drive them back to their ships, and they have to go home. And this is when people are waiting in Athens with bated breath, wondering, are we going to lose it all today? And that's when the runner, we're told from tradition, a guy named Philippi, runs the 26.2 miles from Marathon to Athens. And when he gets there, he says, Nike, Nike. You would pronounce it Nike, Nike. Victory, victory. And he dies, which proves that running kills. Just saying. So 10 years later, Xerxes says, I'm going to finish what Dad started and could not accomplish. And I'm not going to sail an army across the Aegean. I'm going to build a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, the most narrow bit of land that separates what we know as Asia and Europe. And I'm going to build a pontoon bridge, and I'm going to march the biggest army the world has ever seen, and we're going to crush the city-states of Greece, and we're going to burn Athens to the ground. So this is where we find things like the Battle of Thermopylae, the last stand of the 300 of the Spartans. That happens right at this point. And Xerxes' army does get into the mainland of Greece and does burn Athens to the ground. Athens has been evacuated wisely. And then there are two major battles, one at sea called Salamis, one on land a year later called Plataea, which destroys Xerxes' armies, and he goes back in defeat to Persia, which might explain his grumpiness in the book of Esther. So he gets back. And after he leaves and after the Persians are booted out of Greece, Athens is rebuilt. This is known as the Golden Age of Athens, when it is rebuilt. The entire city is built as a monument to their patron goddess, Athena. Things like the Parthenon on the Acropolis is built as a monument to her. There are temples and statues and stuff like that all over the city to resonate with the very deep religious culture that Greece has been for generations, for hundreds of years. It has been like this. And so Paul understands that everybody is religious. He is distressed by the idolatry as he is going through the city. Right there in chapter 17, verse 16, it says, Paul's greatly distressed to see that the city is full of idols. That word distressed does not mean ticked off. Does not mean somehow disappointed or even bemused. It really means what it says. It is the very same word that the New Testament authors would use of Jesus as he is moving through the towns and villages, distressed to see how the people are helpless, harassed, and like sheep without a shepherd. That word harassed, talking about Jesus and his ministry, would be used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The idea of the Assyrians, when they would string somebody up by their wrists and they would start flaying the skin off their arms alive. Or the word distressed, talking about Jesus being distressed, how they are helpless. That is the same Greek word as someone who is so intoxicated they cannot stand up on their own. That word distress, the best word picture I can give you means when you hear something that really bothers you and your heart just sinks into your stomach. As a pastor, as a guy who served as a pastor in the inner city of Scranton, I experienced that more than once. When my phone would ring at 2:30 in the morning, even in Scranton, nobody calls their pastor at 2:30 in the morning to just check up on him. Hey, pastor, just want to see how you're doing. Want to go out for pizza? No. It's too late and I'm too old. I can't do that. So they didn't do that. But when your phone rings as a pastor at 2:30 in the morning, that's generally not good news. And in the modern age, and has been for many years now, you can look at your phone to see who is calling you instead of actually picking it up, right? So you know who it is, and you know basically when that call comes, this is going to be bad news. And my heart would sink. I was distressed when that call would come. This is how Paul sees the idolatry. Notice he's not offended, indignantly angry. He's distressed. because he knows how messed up the culture of Athens is. And thirdly, a piece of understanding is Paul knew the thought culture of his world. Or another way of saying that, Paul knew the thought language of his world. One of my heroes who I never got the chance to meet, who's with the Lord now, is a guy named Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was a guy, particularly in the 60s and 70s. He died in the mid-80s, but in the 60s and 70s, he had his fingers on the pulse of culture and understood what things were happening. He was a Presbyterian pastor. He and his wife, Edith, started a ministry in Weimar, Switzerland called L'Abri, which is French for the shelter. And among other things, Francis Schaeffer was a guy who recognized in the 60s and 70s there's a whole group of people that we would refer to as hippies that the church had ignored. Some of you are smiling maybe because you're deep down a hippie, or maybe you still are one. I don't know. That's okay. But he recognized that the church was not engaging what we would call hippies, and he felt that someone needed to, and he said, we will build a place and you can come to us. And we will answer your questions, and we will engage you with the truth of God's word. I love that stuff. And one of the first books that was published under Schaeffer's name is called Escape from Reason, and it comes from a series of talks that he gave at Wheaton University, Wheaton College, back in the 1960s. And they just put it all together, put it in a book. And the opening paragraph of that book captured my attention, because Schaeffer said, if you Christians in your churches have missionaries anywhere on the field that are effective, and you want to find out why, bring them home and ask them some questions about their effectiveness, and they're going to say things that you're going to expect. So if they're on a foreign field, you're going to expect them to say things like, well, we speak the language. We can read it. We can write it. We understand their food, their clothing, how they interact with one another. We understand the politics of the region where we live. But what Schaeffer said is the thing you may not understand or may not be prepared for is that they will also tell you one of the reasons they are effective is because they understand the thought language of the people to whom their ministry. So they don't just understand what they believe, but why. And Schaeffer said, once you can do that, you can then speak truth into someone's life. Me, as a missionary to college students, I could tell you what the average college student believes, but I've dedicated my adult life to understanding why. I try to understand why they believe what they believe so that I'm just not throwing data at them, but I'm trying to give them something that is transformative and trying to explain it to them in a way that their thought language is going to be able to wrap their minds around, which is a bit of a Herculean effort sometimes, as you can imagine. So the thought culture of his world. Now, in verse 18, it says that a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers begin to debate with him and say, what is this babbler trying to say? It appears he is advocating foreign gods. Now, this is the bit that sometimes we may skip over. Now, let me just say the reason why Epicurean and Stoic philosophers are having a problem with what Paul is talking about is not because they are philosophers. In fact, I've had folks come up to me before in churches, this has happened more than once, and say, well, Paul's problem in Athens is that he uses philosophy. Well, if you've read the rest of Acts, this is not the first time. When it says he reasons in the marketplace, he does that in Berea. If you go back through the book of Acts, beginning with Paul's conversion in chapter 9, you see that this happens over and over and over. So it's not like this unique, I'm going to try something new in Acts at all. But the reason why Epicureans and Stoics have a problem with what Paul is talking about is because neither one of those groups have any concept of a resurrection. So Luke tells us that Paul is in the marketplace talking to the God-fearing Greeks, anybody who wants to listen to him, about the good news of the resurrection of Jesus. And then these guys come along, the Epicureans and Stoics, and they say, what is this babbler trying to say? It seems that he is trying to promote foreign gods. We're going to talk about that in a second. But I just want to tell you a little bit about Epicureans and Stoics, because they are among us today. So the Epicureanism was founded conveniently by a guy named Epicurus. It's kind of nice when that kind of stuff happens. So Epicurus is the founder of Epicureanism. It is a way of thinking, a school of thought that predates Christianity by over 300 years. And he had this idea that the ultimate good is pleasure. So Epicureans wanted a life free of pain. Now that sounds like a complete heathen way of thinking, doesn't it? No. I'm sure in a group of this size, and as I make a simple visual observation and I see the age range in this room, it would not surprise me that at least one of you this morning, as you regain your consciousness and start to have cogent thoughts, and perhaps you just fire off a quick prayer to God as you wake up and ask God, God, please, would you give me a day, or at least a little time today that is free of pain? How dare you? No, that's appropriate. My dad worked hard jobs, and he was a professional firefighter. And every time I see him, he's closer and closer to walking at a 90-degree angle. He shuffles as he walks. He's got a lot of things going on. He's in pain, and he asks God to help him with that. That's appropriate. That's appropriate. However, the Epicureans would say that the ultimate good is pleasure, and therefore the ultimate evil is pain. In fact, it is this guy Epicurus that developed what is perhaps the strongest argument against the existence of God. It's called the logical problem of evil. You may have never heard of it stated that way before, but I bet you've heard it stated this way. If God is so good, why do bad things happen to good people? You've heard this. And if you've never asked yourself that question, I guarantee you will. And it was Epicurus that developed that argument 300 years before the time of Christ. It's certainly not insurmountable. There are plenty of ways to defeat that argument, but logically speaking, it does make sense. And it is used to this day. This guy came up with it. So they wanted a life that maximized pleasure. By Paul's day, Epicureans kind of turned into the party animals of the first century. So if you kind of have that word picture that I do of a bunch of people standing around just partying their faces off, toga, toga, toga. Well, that's kind of what they turned into by Paul's day. Or one of Paul's contemporaries, a Stoic named Seneca, who was an advisor to Nero, actually said of the Epicureans in the first century, they eat to vomit and vomit to eat. So that's how hard they partied. So if they had T-shirts made, it would say things like, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, or perhaps YOLO, you only live once, or party like it's 1999. So something to that effect they would get printed on their T-shirts and wear them proudly. The Epicureans were also the closest thing to atheists in the ancient world. So our contemporary idea of atheism, or a disbelief in any gods at all, was really quite rare in the ancient world, even by the first century. But Epicureanism was as close as they came. So you could read, and these things are readily available to anybody, you could read Epicurean texts on the gods. In fact, Epicurus himself wrote a book called De Ira Dei, or in English that is On the Anger of the Gods. Now, whenever Epicureans talk about gods, it's with giant air quotes, and it's kind of like wink, wink, tongue-in-cheek. All right, we're going to talk about the gods, but honestly. And they had to, because it was such a religious place that they had to address the issue. That makes sense, right? So here's what the Epicureans believed about the gods. They believed that the gods, if they exist at all, so capital I, capital F, if the gods, Zeus, Apollo, Athena, my favorite, Hephaestus, because he makes armor, Poseidon, all these guys, Hades, by the way, I think Batman is pretty much a contemporary equivalent to Hades. I'm willing to have that debate with you, though, John. So I'm willing to have that debate with you. Anyway, it's pretty easy to figure out, like Wonder Woman's Athena, Aquaman is Poseidon. Pretty sure Batman is Hades. I'm just going with that. So they would say, if the gods exist at all, they are just like us anyway. And just like us in the sense that they change their minds, they don't get along, they have bad attitudes, and they really haven't told us what they want. Okay, if they exist, then maybe they have superpowers, but they're just like us, and they don't care about us, so we shouldn't care about them. And in many senses, Epicurus is right about the ancient Greek gods. Or later on, the guy that comes after him, a guy named Lucretius, would say about the Roman gods. They're right. They are just like us. A simple reading of Homer's Iliad would show you that. They don't get along, and they haven't told us what they want. So, basically, they're saying, since there are no gods, there is no problem. Now, surely, Epicureanism died somewhere in the 1st century. Maybe it got as far as the 2nd century, and there's no such thing as an Epicurean today, right? You do live near a state university, do you not? Do you think there's anybody engaged with the state university that thinks about partying quite a bit? Maybe couple, 2 or 3 of them, yeah. And it's not just, so I know in my mind, if I wasn't involved with a university ministry and I thought about what is a university like, I would have in my mind some kind of combination of drunken Viking and Tasmanian devil. And I'm not sure if you put those 2 things together, what you get. Tasmanian Viking? Oh, that'd be terrible, right? That can really hold its liquor, I guess. But we kind of picture this like destructive force that just kind of like a tornado rolls through campus. No, I don't really see that. My students are very polite. They're very respectful. They go out of their way to show me respect. But I also listen when I'm walking through the quad to my classroom, or as I'm sitting in the coffee shop enjoying not a kombucha, but like, you know, a man's drink, coffee. And I'm listening to the, so sorry for men who drink kombucha. I'll pray for you. You could just remind me. But I listen to them and I listen to what they talk about. In fact, at the University of Scranton, I never would have known this. They have a group of people that they hire that works at the university, and they're nutritionists. I don't know if you see that at SUNY Fredonia as well, but they have a group of people that actually try to figure out what students are eating. Now, my culinary experience at college was, well, bearable. It wasn't really something, we looked forward to going to meals because we got to sit down with our buddies. But it wasn't because we were enjoying the food. I'm going to tell you right now, where I teach, those students eat well. Lunch every day is like the marriage supper of the Lamb. You cannot eat all the options you have, and it's a fresh food company. They make it right in front of you, what you're eating. So it's not like they just put it in steam tables and it's got this film over it and it's growing a 4th generation mold colony by the time you get there for late lunch. It's fresh and it's delicious, and they do special things all the time. So the nutritionists want to make sure that the students are eating that stuff, and they actually figured out not all that long ago that there is quite a large group of students that will eat just enough calories during the week to stay alive, because they're banking them up to drink them on the weekends. Now, I heard that and I thought, you got way too much time on your hands, and you got some kind of wild imagination. There's no stinking way. That's dumb. Come on, give me a break. And then I ask my students. And I teach basically underclassmen. So basically the age range, and it varies sometimes, but most everyone in any classroom that I'm teaching is somewhere between 18 and 20. So they're not old enough to drink anyway. And I just on a whim dropped this on one of my classes, and I said, you guys got to tell me if this is true. And I started talking to them about it, and they're all kind of looking at each other like, he's going to judge us. He's going to report us. I said, no, I'm not asking you to confess if you're drinking alcohol and you're not of age, I'm not asking you to tell me. I'm not here to get you in trouble, but I'm here to understand, is this really happening? And you need to know that my classroom I declare sanctuary because I hate the term safe space because that's dumb. So I declare my college classroom sanctuary because it's one of 2 places on the planet where you should be able to ask honest questions and receive an honest answer. You know where the other place is, don't you? But the college classroom is quickly being lost to us, but not as long as I'm there. So I declare my classroom for 3 hours a week sanctuary, and I tell my students, you are under the protection of the warrior priest. That's me. So you can come in and you can talk about things. You're protected here. And they said, yeah, this happens all the time. Wow. Which should make sense to me because spring break, where I teach, is not centered around Easter. It's actually centered around the St. Patrick's Day parade in Scranton Parade Day, and they send kids home over St. Patrick's Day parade weekend because the off-campus housing, which is right across the street, literally, from the campus, looks like a war zone. They call in the mounted police units on horses, so there's like dudes on horses to keep everybody contained. It looks like a war zone. So they send kids home to try to avoid that. So this is all making sense. So yeah, if you're thinking there's no Epicureans, oh, there certainly are. And if I had to give you a contemporary example, it'd probably be this young lady here. This is just one of an example I give you. This is Miley Cyrus. And this is among the more appropriate pictures I can show you on a Sunday morning. So yes, there are Epicureans among us today. Well, what about the Stoics then? So that guy in that picture, that's actually a bust of Marcus Aurelius, 2nd century emperor of Rome. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, he's a character there. If you go to wherever your nearest big box bookstore is, a Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, you go to the philosophy section, you're going to find brand new, shiny, repackaged books of Marcus Aurelius' writings called Meditations. Much of what we know of Stoicism comes from his pen. But the Stoics are different than the Epicureans in that they were not the atheists of the ancient world. They did believe in God, but God for them is not a person. It's more of a what. So it's not a who, it's a what. And for the Stoics, the what is reason itself. And so they believed in a life that maximized virtue, or a life that maximized being in control. So the ultimate good for a Stoic is being in control. And they would say that being out of control of something you can control, that is evil. And they had a list of things you could and could not control. Stoics could be anywhere from a slave, like one of its writers, a guy named Epictetus, all the way up to emperors like Marcus Aurelius. Anybody in between could be a Stoic. But it's just this idea of being in control of all things that you can control, including your emotions, how you interact with people. It is being in total control, and it is internal to you to be in control. So if they had t-shirts, it would be things like, be ready, you can handle it, or pull yourself up by your bootstraps, because the idea was for them to get as close to reason as they can to see life pass beneath them. So if you ever heard somebody use the phrase and talking about something that's going on in their life and just say, well, it's beneath me, or that idea, that comes from Stoicism. That directly comes from Stoicism. Because their word picture was they wanted to raise themselves is the key term here, above the fray of life so that they could see it kind of pass by in this giant highway. And those things that they could take in and control, they would. The other things that they could not, they would be singing along with Elsa, let it go. Right? We have some modern examples of Stoics as well. Probably this guy is among the greatest examples of Stoicism I could give you. And I dare do it. I'll mention it in the same breath. We could have Master Yoda or Mr. Spock on that. I can't put them both on the same screen because the universe would unravel. You're just not allowed to do that. Sci-fi people, you know what I'm talking about. But he would be another example. Or if you are interested in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Thanos is a Stoic. You would notice if you've seen any of the Avenger movies that have Thanos in it, he's always in control of his emotions. He doesn't lose his cool. And Thanos, when he wants to get the Infinity Stones on his left-handed gauntlet, snap his fingers, his goal is to have a great reset. We might call it a great conflagration. He wants to reset. He wants to wipe out half of all people to start all over again as a cleansing process. Do you know who else believed in that? Stoics. They believed that every so often, every so many eons, that there would be this great cleansing fire that would start everything all over, and things would go well. I started watching the Christian Bale trilogy of Batman movies again, and in the very first one, Ra's al Ghul, the bad guy there, he's a Stoic as well. Because at the end, he says, it is us that let society go so far, and when they get so corrupted, we bring a plague, we bring a fire, we bring a flood, and we wipe out a good number of people so that they are cleansed and start all over again. That is Stoicism, and that is hopeless. When Luke says, some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. That advocating foreign gods is not the first time that it was said in Athens. This has been said before. Little over 400 years before this, in the same place, in the marketplace, and the Greek word is Agora, it would be the equivalent of our modern day Walmart. And just like today, I don't care who you are, at some point, you might be so bougie that you don't want to be caught dead in Walmart. You eventually have to go. Do you not? Now, I glory in the proletariat of Walmart, because where else can you get a car battery, a shirt, and go to Subway all at the same time? Where? It's glorious. Now, in Paul's day, he's getting a blanket for his camel, a new toga, and he's probably going to Gyro Way as opposed to Subway. Please don't argue with me about how to pronounce the word gyro. I've studied Greek, and it makes no sense. I just don't get it. It's Euro. Then we shouldn't spell it that way. I'm sorry. I get angry. This is also one of my chief questions when I get to heaven. God, how do you say this word? Because I've asked like literal people from Greece, and they can't explain it to me either. So it's a mystery. But this has been said there before. In 399 BC, a short, balding, pug-nosed, kind of ugly philosopher was sentenced to death by a jury of his peers. His name was Socrates. Socrates, who would go through the marketplace and have conversations with just regular people, made a really interesting observation. He said, you know what? I wonder what holds everything together. What is at the center of all things? Why is there order instead of disorder? Why is there cosmos instead of chaos? Why don't we don't go flinging off the planet? Why do the seasons keep happening like they're supposed to? I think we're supposed to be in springtime, but, Western New York, whatever is happening with the snow. I drove through pretty much a blizzard to get here the other day. I think spring is coming. But Socrates would say, why do these things continue to happen regularly? Why can we make observations of the constellations and we know what they're going to do? Who or what holds all of these things together? And he made a really interesting observation that was really quite revolutionary in his time. He said, for generations, for centuries, we Greeks have believed it is the gods, plural. And Socrates said, I've read our literature, and you could read the same thing. Read the first couple chapters in the Iliad. And you would find out the same observation that Socrates made. That the Greek gods changed their minds. They don't get along. There's all kinds of infighting. And they haven't told us what they want. They never tell you. I am Zeus, and I want you to do X, Y, and Z. They never tell you. And so Socrates said, it cannot be the gods that hold everything together because they can't even hold themselves together. So you know what Socrates said? I believe it is one God. This is fascinating. And he wasn't sure if it was a who or a what, but he had a name for it. He said, there's got to be something that holds it all together. Do you know what his name was for that? Logos. So those of you who are familiar, at least with a Greek word or two, would be thinking right now, wait a minute, that cannot be the same logos that John is writing about in John 1. Oh, it is. In John 1, written to a Greek audience, John is saying, hey, Greeks, that thing you've always been looking for, of what holds it all together, because that is truly a great definition of the word logos. Yes, it can be interpreted as word, but the greater understanding is the unifying principle, or what is the center of all things. John says, I know who it is, I know where he is, and I know his name. Oh, and by the way, something you Greeks would never come up with on your own, the Word became flesh. The center of all things is now among us. So Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth, which I happen to love that concept, by the way. I intend to corrupt the youth, in the name of Jesus, of course. But I intend to corrupt the youth. But Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth by advocating foreign gods. This is not the first time this accusation has flown in Athens. By advocating foreign gods. All right, now we're going to really blaze through the next few parts. So I'm going to give you the Giessman translation just for time's sake, and you can, if you want a homework assignment, I won't hold you to it. You just read on your own the rest of the chapter, make sure I'm telling you the truth. So they bring Paul to what I consider the faculty lounge of the University of Athens, verse 19. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we like to know what they mean. And then verse 21, all the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Does that sound like a culture you know of? Do you have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram? There's some things that do not change. So then Paul stood up, verse 22, in a meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see every way that you are very religious. So now Paul takes the opportunity. So here's the second necessary cause. First one is he understands his world that he's speaking into. And now in the second two parts with the opportunity, and then I'll give you number 3 here in just a minute, this is going to be a master's class on using general revelation to get to who Jesus is. In my world, we would call this natural religion or natural philosophy. I was taught in Bible college and in the church that I grew up in that general revelation, or things that we can know about God by making simple observations about our world, that Psalm 19, Romans 1 tell us about, well, those are okay, but they really don't do anything for you. Not true. Used judiciously, they are powerful weapons to communicate truth. Tool is probably a better word. Weapons against the enemy, tools to help communicate the gospel. Powerful tools. And Paul's about to give a master class on how that works. So he stands up in the Areopagus, he says, notice he does not say, men of Athens, I believe what I believe, you believe what you believe, and that's kind of cool, and let's just go about our merry way. No, he says, I see in every way you are extremely religious people. In fact, I have looked carefully at your objects of worship, and even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So what you have worshipped in ignorance today, I'm going to tell you the difference. I didn't have time when I was over at the university on Friday to look carefully at the objects of worship. I wish I did. But whenever I visit a campus, and SUNY Fredonia is not the first campus I've spoken on, when I have time, I go to the places that are going to help me understand what that particular group of people that university basically worships. There's 2 places I go, if I can find them. Whatever is the equivalent of the student union building, and I'll go and I will look at all the posters and flyers that are pinned up everywhere, and I spend time carefully looking at that stuff. The other place I go is the bookstore. Not because I need swag from whatever university I'm visiting, but I actually go to the stacks where they're selling the textbooks, and I often have to ask permission because they have that stuff roped off. I just say, hey, I'm a philosophy prof from a school in Scranton. They're like, okay, weirdo, you can go look at the books. And so I look at English, religion, history, and philosophy. And very often I'll find the same title in all of those same sections. And it's usually something along the lines of, hey, Marx wasn't as bad as we thought, and maybe we should be the ones to give it a try because it's really going to work this time. Not going to happen, by the way. But I look carefully at those objects of worship so I can understand. And Paul does the same thing. He doesn't turn a blind eye, oh, I can't look at this, it's heathen, it's pagan, it's not Christian. No, he needs to understand the world into which he's ministering, as do you. So he takes this great opportunity to say there's a fundamental difference between how and what you believe and how and what I believe, which leads us to the final piece, and that is authority. And the reason I'm going through these so fast is because this is probably more familiar territory to you than some of the other stuff. So the authority is this. Paul says, what you've worshipped in ignorance, I'm going to tell you the difference today, which is pretty gutsy to say something like that to somebody. I mean, if we actually had more Christians in the name of Jesus who would be willing to do that with their neighbors and coworkers when given the opportunity, instead of finding all the comparisons, oh, you believe, I believe, we all believe. Yeah, you know who that's the gospel according to? Walt Disney. That says that you can believe, as long as you believe, you're good. And Walt Disney says if you believe deep down in your heart, it must be true. Abject nonsense. Just because you believe something does not make it true. Conversely, just because you disbelieve something does not make it untrue. God does not exist because a majority of people in this room believe that he is. He is because he is. And we would do well to believe it. And if we could communicate this to people, and yes, okay, you can start off with a comparison, that's fine, Paul does that. But if all we ever do is make comparisons for Christianity and other worldviews, other religions, and you never get to the contrast, you are not getting at the heart of the gospel, ever. Because the gospel is radical. It is different. So Paul stands up and he takes authority and he says, okay, men of Athens, I see in every way you're very religious, but let's talk about the difference between your gods and the God I serve. And now this is the Giessman translation. Your gods need you, Greeks, to build them houses, barns, and sheds. Again, do a simple reading of any ancient Greek work, like Iliad, Odyssey, Theogony, any of these ancient books, or look at any other ancient religion, whether it be from the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Mesopotamians, or the Babylonians, just to name a few. And you will see the same theme every time. You'll see a pantheon that means a bunch of gods that needs people to do stuff for them. In fact, it's fascinating, going back to that idea of the university experience in Daniel. I'm so nerdy, I sat down to try to figure out what did they study in their 3 years in the accelerated program in the Hammurabi School of Theology. I made that up. But I tried to figure out what did they study, and I think I came to some conclusions. One of the books talks about how the gods became gods. It's called the Enuma Elish. And the gods are laying around the Mesopotamian, Babylonian version of Mount Olympus one day, and they're like, hey, you know what we need? What would be awesome is if we had a sentient being that we could create that would make sandwiches for us. And they're like, cool, let's make one. And one of the gods is like, not so fast. We'll make one, but let's make sure we make them flawed so they die off on a regular basis, because we all know we're going to get sick of them. Because we need them, but we don't like them. This is the theme throughout all ancient views of religion. All of them. Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Egyptian, all of them. They make them flawed. Paul points out, look, your gods actually need you to make them sandwiches, build them houses, barns. The God of the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, does not need me. Just like he says, Paul also says something very similar in Philippians 3. You serve God by the Spirit, not by the flesh. He doesn't need you. I will never forget the day in theology class in Bible college where I had a professor kind of leaned over the lectern and he told this class of I don't know how many freshmen we were in this Bible college. They all thought we were pretty much awesome because here we are serving God. We're going to be the elite and go out and pastor and missionary and teach and do all the things God needs us to do. And he leaned across the lectern and said, I have some news for you, ladies and gentlemen. God doesn't need any of you to accomplish his will. Yes, he does. That's what the recruiter said when he came to my Christian school or my camp. And that's why I'm here paying a lot of money, because God needs me. He doesn't need you. He calls you to serve. But if he needs you, you know what God is not? God. If there's anything that he cannot do for himself, apart from you, he is not God. And he's no better than the Greek or Roman God. So Paul points that out. God I serve doesn't need me, but also the God I serve actually likes me. Your gods don't even like you. Once in a while maybe, but they are very quick to change their minds. Again, I could point this out to you in the same things that I'm sure Paul studied. It's very simple to see. But Paul goes on to say, and he says, look, the God that I serve has made all things, including you, and has set the times and seasons where all people live, so that some will seek him and find him. There's no finding the Roman gods or the Greek gods at this point. You can't seek and find them. They're not to be found. And then Paul comes to the end of the speech and he says, and the way that you know this is true is because God raised his son from the dead. Show me in Greek literature where that's happened. Now, people try to make comparisons of some things in Greek and Roman literature. There are not. And then at the end of the story, we're told that two people by name give their lives to Jesus. A woman named Damaris and a guy named Dionysius. Now, I've had people come up to me in churches and say, well, this is an example of Paul failing because he used man's logic and not God's logic. Okay, a couple things about that. So I'm just trying to head this off before it gets there. First of all, you're going to have to tell me the difference between man's logic and God's logic, because logic is logic. Where do we get the word logic from? Logos. Who is the Logos? Jesus. So logic as a thing cannot just exist on its own. It's got to be part of God's character. Just like truth, love, grace, mercy. They're not built into the physical universe. They're not part of the periodic table of elements. You can't go to Walmart and buy any of those by the pound, thinly sliced. So they'll say, well, yep, Paul failed because only two people are mentioned as giving their lives to Jesus. And that's a failure? In a pre-Christian world. Actually, it says, some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. So just because they're not all mentioned by name, I think there is more than just these two. By the way, this Dionysius guy, he goes on to become the bishop of Athens, the first pastor in the literally first Baptist church of Athens. I'm almost certain that's not what it was called. But he's the first pastor, according to church history. So something really good happened here. So I just want to encourage you, as a church, I assume, and I'm pretty confident in my assumption, that you are concerned about your community. You're concerned about the people group that's just a few miles from here at the State University. I'm rather confident that you're concerned about your neighbors and family members who are yet far from God. I have confidence that you have a deep, abiding Christian love and concern for them. Well, if I could, I would just remind you to do three things. Do your best to understand their world. Some of the things that you may need to investigate will seem unwholesome to you. Like, should I read these things? Should I study these things? And you got to be discerning and make some judgments there. But overall, the answer is yes. I have read nearly everything arch-atheist Friedrich Nietzsche has written. I've studied it. Or 20th century atheist guy named Albert Camus, who's written books like The Plague A Happy Death, The Stranger, The Myth of Sisyphus. I've studied The Rebel. I've studied this stuff. Why? Because I want to understand how this generation thinks. My poor wife is like, why are you reading this again? I need to get one of those stamps that says heretical material for study purposes only. Just put it on the book so people don't worry about me as much, I guess. And I'm not saying you have to read what I read, but the principle is still the same. And we can all begin by very confidently asking God for wisdom so that we understand the times. Yes? And then take every opportunity that you are given, wisely, judiciously, strategically. And when those opportunities come, make sure that you are prepared so that you can speak with authority. Do not be hung up on the comparisons only. Make sure you understand the contrasts and point out the glorious difference. And be a light in a dark place. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for the opportunity to share with my brothers and sisters this morning. I thank you for this church. I thank you for Pastor Mark and the rest of the leadership and what is being accomplished here. God, I pray that you would encourage them, lead them, guide them, and help them to understand. We love you and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.